The year is 432 BCE. We begin not on a battlefield, but atop the Pnyx, the rocky hill west of the Acropolis in Athens. From this vantage point, the viewer observes the Athenian machine in its most potent theoretical form. Below, the long wall's two parallel veins of stone and lime stretch 6 kilometers toward the Piraeus. This is more than masonry. It is a tactical blueprint rendered in granite. To the Athenian strategist Pericles, these walls transformed the city into an artificial island, a fortress of logic that decoupled the city's survival from the surrounding soil of Attica. The dilemma for any observer, then and now, is the sheer audacity of this design, a land-based power attempting to exist entirely independent of the land. To understand the Peloponnesian War is to understand the design of conflict, the cold, geopolitical calculus that made the clash between Athens and Sparta an analytical certainty. Thucydides, our primary source and a failed general himself, identified the Thucydides trap, the structural friction generated when a rising power. Athens threatens to displace an established one, Sparta. This was not merely a diplomatic disagreement. It was a collision of two incompatible operating systems. Athens was a democratic thalassocracy, a sea-based empire driven by liquid capital, maritime innovation, and radical expansion. Sparta was an oligarchic telerocracy, a land-bound military caste system predicated on static order, agricultural stability, and the brutal suppression of a slave class, the Helots. The geopolitical canvas of 431 BCE was a mosaic of tension. The 30 Years' Peace, signed in 446 BCE, had been a temporary system reset, a pause to allow both powers to consolidate their spheres of influence. However, the peace functioned as a pressure cooker. Athens, under Pericles, had converted the Delian League, originally a defensive alliance against Persia, into a formal empire. The tribute paid by subject cities was no longer a voluntary contribution for defense. It was the venture capital of Athenian hegemony. This capital funded the triremes that policed the Aegean, creating a feedback loop. Wealth built the ships, and the ships secured the wealth. The first surgical incisions that led to total war were not fought on open ground, but in the corridors of economic and diplomatic maneuvering. The Megarian decree was the ancient equivalent of a total trade embargo. By banning Megara Spartan life from all ports within the Athenian Empire, Pericles utilized economic interdiction as a weapon of war. It was a masterpiece of non-kinetic friction. Megara was being strangled without a single spear being thrown. To Sparta, this was an intolerable violation of the balance of power. If Athens could use its maritime monopoly to destroy an ally's economy, then no city-state in the Peloponnese was safe. The tactical dilemma shifted to Corcyra, modern Corfu. Corcyra possessed the second-largest navy in Greece. For Athens, Corcyra was a force multiplier. For Sparta, its alignment with Athens was a strategic nightmare that would grant the Athenians total naval supremacy in the Adriatic. When a local conflict between Corcyra and Corinth, Sparta's primary naval ally, escalated, Athens intervened. This was a surgical strike on the existing power structure. At the Battle of Sabota, Athenian triremes stood as a passive deterrent, a naval salient that effectively told the Corinthians, "The maritime order is ours to define." Behind the Athenian aperture lay the Periclean doctrine. Pericles understood that Athens could not win a traditional land war. The Spartan Phalanx was a kinetic apex predator. In a symmetrical engagement, the Athenian hoplites would be shredded by the professionalized violence of the Spartans. Therefore, the Athenian grand strategy was one of asymmetric attrition. The plan was deceptively simple and agonizingly difficult. Withdraw the entire population of Attica behind the long walls. Abandon the ancestral farms. Watch from the battlements as the Spartans burned the olive groves and grain fields. In response, use the navy to raid the Peloponnesian coast, inciting internal friction by encouraging Helot revolts. This was a surgical logic that ignored the human forge. To the Athenian farmer, his land was his identity. Being asked to watch his legacy burn while he huddled in the stifling heat of a crowded city was a psychological toll that Pericles underestimated. The strategy required a level of disciplined endurance that tested the very fabric of Athenian democracy. It turned the city into a pressure vessel. The logistical friction of feeding 200,000 people within a fortified perimeter, entirely dependent on the Black Sea grain route, was a masterpiece of organizational risk. One break in the naval umbilical cord at the Hellespont, and the fortress would become a tombs across the Isthmus of Corinth. The Spartan king Archidamus II faced his own tactical salient. He was a conservative strategist who realized that a war with Athens would be left to our children. He understood the logistical immunity of a sea power. How do you defeat a power you cannot reach? He argued in the Spartan assembly. But the hawks in the Gerousia, led by the ephors, saw only the relative decline of Spartan prestige. Their order of battle was based on the decisive stroke. They believed that by ravaging Attica, they would force the emotional collapse of the Athenian citizenry, dragging them out for a final reckoning on the plains of Eleusis. Sparta's geopolitical canvas was anchored by the Peloponnesian League, a confederation of land powers that provided the mass for the Spartan hammer. However, the League was a fragile coalition. Corinth. The naval engine of the League was constantly pushing for war to protect its trade interests, while the smaller states feared the kinetic spillover of a total conflict. The logistics of the Peloponnesian Phalanx were limited by the harvest cycle. These were not professional soldiers except for the Spartans themselves. They were citizen militias who needed to return to their farms. This created a temporal window for every Spartan invasion. They had 40 days to break Athens before their own economic foundation required them to march home. The aperture now widens to the Persian shadow. In the east, the Achaemenid Empire watched the Greek Civil War with the cold eye of Ea, venture capitalist of chaos. To Persia, the Greek Poles were a malignant collective that had humiliated them at Marathon and Salamis. The Persian design was simple: fund the weaker side to ensure both sides bled to death. While not yet kinetic in 431 BCE, the Persian variable was the hidden architecture of the war. Every Athenian trireme built was a concern for the satraps in Sardis, and every Spartan setback was an opportunity for gold-backed diplomacy. As the first Peloponnesian spears crossed the border into Attica in May of 431 BCE, the design of conflict was complete. The architectonics were set: a sea power that refused to fight on land and a land power that could not yet fight at sea. A fortress city vs. a nation of soldiers. It was a war of static defenses against mobile raids. The pivot point was no longer a single battle, but the structural integrity of the respective empires. Would the Athenian naval umbilical hold? Would the Spartan coalition of land fracture under the strain of a long-term siege? The mobilization was a masterpiece of logistical friction. The Athenian Piraeus buzzed with the art of survival, the sound of 200 triremes being pitched, the shouting of merchants from Egypt and the Crimea, and the rhythmic oop-pop of the rowers practicing their surgical maneuvers. In Sparta, the silence was equally heavy. The Agoge, the Spartan training system, had reached its peak output. The human forge was ready. The Greek Civil War was no longer a theoretical dilemma. It was a kinetic reality. The canvas was primed, and the first stroke would be painted in the smoke of the burning Attic countryside. The design also included the social architecture of the combatants. In Athens, the radical democracy meant that every tactical decision was a political event. The assembly was a volatile processor, capable of brilliant innovation or catastrophic, systemic failure based on the whim of the crowd. In Sparta, the dual kingship and the ephors provided a stable but rigid command structure. This command logic would be tested. Could the Spartan brain adapt to the fluid, maritime reality of the war? And could the Athenian brain remain focused under the grinding attrition of Pericles' plan? As we close this aperture on the design, we see the tragedy of the Greek machine. Both sides were trapped in a zero-sum logic. There was no off-ramp in the architectonics of 431 BCE. The surgical precision of Pericles and the martial purity of Archidamus were both leading toward a total system collapse. The art of war was about to move from the atelier of strategic theory to the trench view of physical grit, sweat, and the art of survival. The design was flawless on paper. The reality would be written in the blood of 30,000 citizens and the ashes of a golden age. the grain of the Mediterranean oak, and the hammered bronze of a shield's rim. We begin with the aperture focused on the aspis, the heavy circular shield of the Greek hoplite. This was the cellular unit of the entire Peloponnesian struggle. To the viewer, it appears not just as armor, but as a component in a larger interlocking machine. The aspis was a concave instrument of wood, roughly 90 centimeters in diameter, faced with a thin sheet of bronze and held by a revolutionary argive grip, a central sleeve for the forearm and a handle at the rim. This design was a tactical enabler. It allowed the soldier to support the weight of the shield on his shoulder, enabling the phalanx to operate as a singular kinetic wall. The order of battle for the land war was dictated by the phalanx, a formation that prioritized collective mass over individual heroism. In its standard configuration, the phalanx was 8 ranks deep. The tactical logic was the athismos, the collective shove. When two phalanxes collided, the engagement was less a series of duels and more a surgical application of pressure. However, within this shared doctrine, the Spartan machine operated on a different operating system than the rest of Greece. While the Athenian hoplite was a part-time soldier, a farmer or craftsman who took up arms for a season, the Spartan, Homoios was a professional war architect from the age of 7. The Spartan was forged in the agoge, a system of institutionalized hardship designed to strip away the individual and leave only the phalanx component. The Spartan order of battle was hierarchically sophisticated. Unlike the disorganized levies of their neighbors, the Spartan army was divided into enimoshai, pentekostes, companies, and lokoi. This modular command structure allowed for surgical maneuvering on the fly. A Spartan commander could issue a flute-signaled order to perform an enfilade shift or a tactical countermarch maneuvers that would cause a less trained Athenian or Theban force to collapse into frictional chaos. The trench view of the hoplite was one of sensory overload and physical grit. Beneath the linothorax, a composite armor made of glued layers of linen that offered ballistic protection against arrows and spears, the soldier was a furnace of sweat. The Corinthian helmet, while providing superior frontal protection, acted as a sensory deprivation chamber, limiting peripheral vision and muffling sound. The art of survival in the phalanx depended on the rhythm of the flute. The Spartans, famously, marched to the sound of flutes not for music, but for tempo control. It ensured the linear integrity of the wall, preventing the formation from sprinting and fracturing before the point of kinetic impact. The weaponry was a study in redundant design. If the dory shattered, which it often did in the initial shock phase, the hoplite transitioned to the xiphos, a double-edged, leaf-shaped short sword, or the kopis, a forward-curving hacking blade. These were secondary systems designed for the surgical work of close-quarter butchery. Once the phalanx had broken the salient, the toll on the human forge was immense. A battle lasting only an hour could leave men physically shattered by the sheer exertion of the athismos, their bodies bruised by the constant compression friction of the shields. If the phalanx was the hammer of the land, the trireme was the surgical scalpel of the sea. An Athenian trireme was not a ship in the traditional sense. It was a manned missile, constructed primarily of light fir and cedar for buoyancy and velocity. The trireme was a 37-meter-long hydrodynamic masterpiece. The architectonics of the hull were reinforced by hyposomata, massive tensioning cables that ran the length of the ship to prevent the hull from hogging or snapping under the torsional stress of high-speed maneuvers. The order of battle at sea was defined by the rowers. 170 men, arranged in 3 tiers. The thranitai, Zygitai, middle, and thalamitai acted as the combustion engine of the vessel. This was a high-maintenance, high-leverage system. Unlike the Hollywood myth of galley slaves, the Athenian rowers were free citizens and professionals. Their proficiency was a technological advantage. An Athenian crew could sustain a tactical dash of 9 knots, allowing them to execute the deklus, a maneuver where the ship would burst through the enemy line, shear off their oars, and circle back for a surgical ramming of the vulnerable stern. The tactical blueprinting of naval warfare in the Peloponnesian War revolved around the ram. The goal was not to board, which was seen as a crude land tactic, but to use kinetic energy to compromise the enemy. structural integrity. This required precision timing and spatial awareness. The calousts and the triarchs had to coordinate the 170 rowers as a single organism. A mistake of a few degrees in the angle of attack could result in a glancing blow, or worse, the ramming ship becoming entangled and vulnerable to enfilade boarding. The logistical engine required to keep these maritime projectiles operational was staggering. A single trireme cost 1 talent of silver per month to maintain in the field, the equivalent of a lifetime's wages for a skilled laborer. With a fleet of 200 ships, Athens was burning through capital at a rate that required the constant extraction of tribute from its allies. This was total economic mobilization. The Atelier of the Piraeus shipyards was a production line of constant maintenance. Ships had to be hauled out of the water regularly to prevent teredo worm infestation and waterlogging, which would increase the ship's drag and ruin its surgical speed. As the war progressed, the order of battle evolved through tactical innovation. The pure phalanx was increasingly supported by peltasts, light infantry named after the pelta. Often recruited from Thrace, these units were disruptive technologies. Equipped with javelins and no heavy armor, they utilized fluid maneuverability to harass the static phalanx. In the broken terrain of Greece, a group of peltasts could use hit-and-run attrition to destroy a superior force of hoplites who were unable to bring their kinetic mass to bear. This was a surgical shift in doctrine, the realization that velocity and range could defeat mass and armor simultaneously. Cavalry, long a secondary asset in Greece, began to be used for operational scouting and logistical interdiction. The Athenian order of battle included 1,000 elite horsemen, used to protect the flanks of the city and prevent Spartan light-armed detachments from burning the suburbs during the sieges. The human forge of the war was not limited to the battlefield. It extended to the logistical chain. For every hoplite in the field, there was a helot or a servant carrying his equipment. For every rower at sea, there was a land-based support system of shipwrights and suppliers. The art of survival meant enduring the surgical brutality of ancient medicine, where an arrow wound often meant a slow death by sepsis, and a crush injury from a shield wall meant permanent disability. The Peloponnesian War's order of battle was a transition from ritual to industry. War was becoming a craft that required specialized knowledge, massive capital, and technological evolution. The surgical perspective reveals that the winner would not be the one with the bravest men, but the one whose machine comprised of men, wood, bronze, and silver could withstand the friction of reality for the longest duration. The aperture opens with a high-definition focus on the soil of Acharni, just 7 miles north of the Athenian walls. It is May 431 BCE. We see a Spartan hoplite, his bronze aspis reflecting the harsh Attic sun, systematically applying a torch to a grove of ancient olive trees. The viewer observes this from the perspective of an Athenian citizen standing upon the city's battlements. The smoke rises in thick, vertical columns, a signal of attrition. Below the walls, the city is a suffocating mass of humanity. Refugees from the countryside huddle in makeshift shelters in the dead space between the long walls. This is the friction of war in its most visceral form, the agonizing disconnect between a grand strategy of strategic insulation and the primal human urge to defend one's hearth. The first phase of the war, the Archidamian War, was defined by strategic symmetrical failure. King Archidamus II of Sparta executed a doctrine of agricultural interdiction. By destroying the grain and olive crops, Sparta aimed to create political friction within Athens, hoping the landed aristocracy would force the assembly into a decisive and likely suicidal land battle. However, the Athenian machine, designed by Pericles, proved remarkably resilient to this kinetic pressure. Because of the long walls and the Piraeus, Athens possessed logistical immunity. As long as the Athenian fleet maintained command of the sea, the city was functionally an island. The Spartan army, despite its tactical dominance, lacked the siegecraft and the logistical tail to sustain a long-term investment of a fortified city. They could only stay as long as their own supplies lasted roughly 40 days before the harvest cycle forced them to return to the Peloponnese. This created a seasonal rhythm of conflict, a repetitive cycle of invasion and retreat that neither side could break. Pericles countered with naval projection, sending fleets of 100 triremes to circumnavigate the Peloponnese. These were surgical raids designed to harass Spartan allies and disrupt their internal stability, yet these raids were sub-tactical. They inflicted annoyance but not systemic damage. The war was settling into a grinding equilibrium, where the frictional heat was slowly eroding the resources of both states without yielding a turning point. In 430 BCE, the friction of war introduced a non-kinetic variable that no strategist could have modeled: the plague. Originating in sub-Saharan Africa and entering through the Piraeus, the pathogen found an ideal incubation chamber in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of besieged Athens. From an analytical perspective, the plague acted as a biological force multiplier for the Peloponnesians. It bypassed the long walls entirely. The order of battle was shattered not by spears but by a systemic pathological collapse. The plague didn't just kill 75,000 to 100,000 citizens, it induced social friction. The moral compass of the city spun wildly as the population realized that neither piety nor wealth offered protection. Lawlessness became a secondary infection. When Pericles himself succumbed to the disease in 429 BCE, the Athenian grand design lost its central processor. The leadership of the city shifted to demagogues like Cleon men who prioritized aggressive kineticism over Periclean restraint. The war machine was now being steered by emotion rather than surgical logic. The friction of empire began to show in 428 BCE when Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, attempted to secede from the Delian League. This was a centrifugal crisis for Athens. If one major ally could revolt during a war, the entire economic engine of the empire might dismantle. The Athenian response was a study in calculated brutality. After the city surrendered, the assembly initially voted to execute every male citizen and enslave every woman and child. The surgical dilemma here was whether terror was a more efficient force multiplier than clemency. The famous Mytilenean debate between Cleon and Diodotus represents the intellectual friction of the era. Cleon argued for total war, the complete annihilation of the enemy to serve as a deterrent. Diodotus argued from a pragmatic perspective, suggesting that such brutality would only make future rebels fight to the death, increasing the cost of suppression. In a rare moment of second-order thinking, the assembly reversed its decision at the last minute, sending a second trireme to race across the Aegean to stop the execution order. It arrived just as the first commander was reading the death warrants. The Atelier of Athenian politics was barely holding together under the strain of the conflict. The year 425 BCE saw the most significant systemic rupture in the Archidamian War, the Battle of Pylos and Sparta. This engagement was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. It began by accident. A storm forced an Athenian fleet, led by the innovative general Demosthenes, to take shelter at Pylos, a rugged, uninhabited promontory on the coast of the Peloponnese. Recognizing the strategic potential of the location, Demosthenes decided to fortify it. This was a surgical insertion into the Spartan rear area. The Spartans, panicked by a permanent Athenian presence in their own territory, reacted with reckless urgency. They landed a contingent of 420 elite hoplites, including many full Spartan piers on the island of Sparta, to blockade the bay. However, an Athenian naval victory trapped these Spartans on the island. The apex predator was now the prey. The tactical dilemma shifted. The Spartans on the island were the finest heavy infantry in the world, but they were trapped in broken terrain without naval support. What followed was a surgical deconstruction of the Spartan myth. Cleon, the Athenian demagogue, took command, promising to capture the Spartans within 20 days, a claim the Athenian generals thought was tactical hubris. Cleon and Demosthenes utilized combined arms doctrine. They didn't send hoplites to fight hoplites. Instead, they landed 800 archers and 800 peltasts. The trench view of Sparta was a nightmare of friction. The island was covered in burnt scrub and ash. The Spartans, weighed down by their bronze armor and massive shields, were kinetic targets in a kill zone as they tried to charge. The Athenian light troops simply retreated, maintaining standoff range and raining javelins and arrows. The Spartans couldn't see their attackers through the clouds of ash and dust. They couldn't hear their officers over the shouting and the whistling of projectiles. Their cohesion was eroded by fragmentary attrition. For the first time in recorded history, the Spartan spirit broke. After their commander was killed, the remaining 292 Spartans, 120 of them full peers, surrendered. This was a psychological earthquake. The forced projection of Sparta rested on the belief that a Spartan never surrenders. By taking these men hostage, Athens had effectively neutralized the Spartan strategic initiative. Sparta ceased its annual invasions of Attica, fearing that the hostages would be executed. The Atelier of war had produced a result that shattered the geometric certainty of Spartan land power. Just as Athens seemed to gain the upper hand, the friction of war shifted to the north. A Spartan general named Brasidas, a tactical visionary who operated outside the traditional Spartan static logic, realized that he could not win in the Peloponnese. He needed to strike at the Athenian resource base. Leading a small, mobile force of helots and mercenaries, Brasidas marched through central Greece to the Chalcidice Peninsula. His target was Amphipolis, the logistical pivot point of the Athenian Empire. Amphipolis controlled the flow of timber and the silver from the Mount Pangaeum mines. Brasidas utilized political warfare, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Athenian phallocratic tyranny in a surgical capture. He seized the city before the Athenian relief force, led by the historian Thucydides himself, could arrive. This loss was a systemic shock to Athens. It threatened the economic foundation of their naval power. In 422 BCE, the two primary aggressors of the war, Cleon of Athens and Brasidas of Sparta, met at the Battle of Amphipolis. It was a high-stakes kinetic collision. In the ensuing chaos, both men were killed. From an analytical perspective, their deaths removed the frictional obstacles to peace. Both states were exhausted. Athens was bleeding resource capital in the north. Sparta was suffering from a manpower deficit and the psychological weight of the Pylos hostages. The resulting Peace of Nicias, 421 BCE, was not a resolution, but a system reset. It was intended to last 50 years, but it was built on faulty architectonics. Neither side had achieved its strategic objectives. The peace treaty was a paper shield that ignored the deep-seated friction between the two leagues. The order of battle had been paused, but the design of conflict remained unchanged. The Greek world was merely in a state of unstable equilibrium, waiting for the next tactical spark to reignite the human forge. The Archidamian War demonstrated that total war is a grinding machine that consumes its architects. We saw the surgical failure of the Spartan land invasion and the resource fragility of the Athenian maritime empire. The turning point at Pylos proved that asymmetric innovation could defeat traditional mass. The rise of Brasidas showed that operational mobility could bypass strategic depth. The human forge had been tempered by 10 years of friction. The soldiers were no longer the idealistic hoplites of 431 BCE. They were veteranized modules of a permanent war machine. The art of war had evolved. It now included biological warfare, economic interdiction, specialized light infantry, and strategic hostage-taking. The Atelier was now preparing for the next, more catastrophic phase, a grand hubris that would take the conflict across the sea to the island of Sicily. The aperture opens not upon a battlefield, but upon the Piraeus in the midsummer of 415 BCE. The viewer observes a spectacle of imperial overreach, unparalleled in the ancient world. 134 triremes, their hulls freshly pitched and gleaming like obsidian, bob in the harbor. On the docks, 5,100 hoplites, the kinetic reserve of the Athenian state, prepare to board. This was not a mere military deployment. It was a masterpiece of mobilization. The assembly had voted for a force so overwhelming that victory seemed a geometric certainty. Yet beneath the grandiosity, the architectonics of failure were already being laid. The expedition to Sicily was a decoupling of strategy from reality, a leap across 700 miles of open sea toward a theater where the friction of distance would eventually consume the machine. At the center of this tactical salient stood a fundamental command failure. The expedition was led by three generals with incompatible operating systems: Alcibiades, a charismatic architect of the gamble, viewed Sicily as a springboard for hegemony, envisioning the conquest of Carthage and the total encirclement of the Peloponnese. Nicias, the cautious conservative who had argued vehemently against the mission, was ironically placed in charge of its execution. Lamachus, the professional war artisan, provided the tactical grit but lacked the political processing power to mediate between his colleagues. This fractured command logic meant that from day one, the Athenian brain was at war with itself. The objective was Syracuse, the most powerful Dorian city-state in the West, a mirror image of Athens in terms of resource depth and naval potential. The Athenian justification was an appeal from Segesta, a minor ally in western Sicily, which claimed to be under threat. In reality, Segesta was a geopolitical bait. They had deceived the Athenian envoys with Potemkin wealth, showing off gilded vessels that were merely silver-plated to lure Athens into a conflict. By the time the Athenian fleet reached the coast of Italy and realized the resource deficit, the kinetic momentum of the expedition was too great to halt. The strategic design shifted toward a siege of Syracuse. Syracuse was not a typical city. It was a continental fortress. Its geography featured the Epipolae, a high, rugged plateau that overlooked the city, and the Great Harbor, a massive enclosed bay that could act as both a refuge and a trap. For the Athenians to succeed, they had to achieve total circumvallation, cutting the city off from its agricultural hinterland and its naval supply routes simultaneously. This was a surgical engineering challenge of the highest order. The friction of war in Sicily was characterized by a duel of masonry. The Athenians landed and seized the Epipolae heights in a lightning ascent, immediately beginning the construction of the Circle, a central fort from which two massive circumvallation walls would extend to the sea. The Syracusans responded not with a direct kinetic confrontation, but with counterwalls. This was positional warfare at its most abstract. The Atelier of conflict became a race of stonemasons and ditch diggers. Every time the Athenians attempted to extend their strangling salient toward the harbor, the Syracusans built a wall at a right angle to intercept them. The human forge here was one of brutal physical labor under the Sicilian sun. The art of survival was measured in the speed of laying bricks and the surgical precision of the Athenian peltas who protected the construction crews from Syracusan cavalry sorties. For a moment, the Athenian design seemed to be winning. They successfully built a double wall that nearly reached the Great Harbor, threatening Syracuse with a total logistical blackout. In 414 BCE, the turning point arrived in the form of a single man, the Spartan general Gylippus. Sparta, acting on the advice of the exiled Alcibiades, who had fled Athens to avoid a trial for sacrilege, sent Gylippus not with an army but as a strategic consultant. Gylippus's arrival was a systemic shock. He slipped through the Athenian naval net and entered Syracuse from the landward side, just as the Athenians were finishing their final wall. Gylippus functioned as a force multiplier. He professionalized the Syracusan defense, introducing combined arms doctrine and restoring the psychological cohesion of the garrison. Under his command, the Syracusans executed a surgical counterattack, building a third counterwall that finally bypassed the Athenian lines. The siege was effectively broken. The Athenians, who had come to invest the city, found themselves inverted. They were now the ones trapped on the plateau, their logistical umbilical to the sea under constant threat. The conflict now shifted to the maritime domain. The Great Harbor of Syracuse became a laboratory of tactical adaptation. The Athenian navy, built for high-velocity maneuvers in the open Aegean, was paralyzed by the confined space of the harbor. They could not execute the Deiplis or the Periplus because there was no room to build kinetic momentum. The Syracusans, advised by Gylippus and Corinthian specialists, implemented a surgical modification to their ships. They reinforced the catheads, the beams supporting the anchors, and thickened the prows of their triremes with massive timber braces. This was a technological countermeasure. In the narrow harbor, they forced the Athenians into head-on ramming. In such a collision, the lighter, faster Athenian ships were shattered by the heavy-mass Syracusan vessels. The precision scalpel of the Athenian navy was being broken by a heavy mallet. The frictional attrition was devastating. The Athenian crews, decimated by disease and the plague of hopelessness, began to lose their operational edge. Nicias, suffering from a debilitating kidney disease, sent a distress signal to Athens: either recall the expedition or send another one of equal size. In a display of grand hubris, the Athenian assembly chose the latter. They sent Demosthenes, the hero of Pylos, with 73 more triremes and 5,000 more hoplites. They were doubling down on a failing system. Demosthenes arrived with kinetic energy, immediately launching a massive night attack on the Epipolae to regain the high ground. This was a high-risk surgical strike. In the darkness, the friction of war became total systemic chaos. The Athenian identification signals, the singing of the paean led to friendly fire incidents as the various Dorian-speaking allies of Athens were mistaken for Syracusans. The Athenian machine fractured in the dark. Men were driven off cliffs, and the cohesion of the force evaporated. Following this failure, Demosthenes urged an immediate strategic withdrawal, but Nicias, paralyzed by a lunar eclipse, which he interpreted as a divine warning, insisted the army wait thrice 9 days. This was a fatal latency. This 27-day delay allowed Gylippus to complete a naval blockade of the great harbor. The Athenian fleet, the greatest maritime force the world had ever seen, was corked inside the bay. The final battle in the great harbor was a surgical horror. 200 triremes were crammed into a space too small for their design. The sound of wood shivering and the screams of the drowning created an orchestra of ruin. The Athenian soldiers on the shore watched in psychological paralysis. When the Athenian fleet was finally driven back to the beach, the structural integrity of the expedition dissolved. The ships were abandoned. The retreat began on land. 40,000 men, many wounded and starving, attempting to march across the rugged interior of Sicily toward safety. This was no longer an army. It was a migration of the damned. The Syracusan cavalry and light-armed peltasts harassed them at every choke point, utilizing enfilade fire and logistical interdiction to pick the column apart. The friction of the retreat was constant. There was no food, no water, and no operational intel. The final incision occurred at the Asinarus River. The parched Athenian soldiers, breaking formation in a primal rush for water, was slaughtered in the riverbed by Syracusan spears. The water ran red with blood, yet the soldiers continued to drink. So great was their biological distress, Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and executed. Surgical removal of the Athenian leadership. The survivors, roughly 7,000 men, were thrown into the Latomia, the deep stone quarries of Syracuse. The human forge here became a meat grinder in these open-air pits, exposed to the blistering heat by day and the freezing cold by night, with only a pint of water and a quart of grain per day. The Athenian reserve force was systematically liquidated. The stench of decomposing bodies became a biological weapon against the living. After 10 weeks, the survivors were sold into slavery. The Sicilian expedition was a total system failure. From an analytical perspective, it represents the maximum entropy of the Athenian Empire. They had lost 200 ships, 50,000 men, and an unimaginable amount of capital. The strategic installation of the long walls was now irrelevant because the manpower to man them was rotting in Sicily. The art of war had been tested to its limits. We saw that mass without logistical depth is a liability. We saw that command incompatibility is a fatal friction. And most importantly, we saw that a maritime power is uniquely vulnerable if its center of gravity, its fleet, is lured into a restricted kinetic domain. The masterpiece was in ruins. And the Greek world watched as the Athenian kraken began to bleed out in the Western Sea. The aperture opens with a surgical focus on a single block of stone being hewn at the heights of Declia, a rugged ridge on the slopes of Mount Parnes. It is 413 BCE from this vantage point. A Spartan sentry looks down not across a temporary battlefield, but over a permanent, strategic salient. Below him, the smoke of Athens' industrial heart, the silver mines of Laurium, begins to gutter and die. To the viewer, this is the visual representation of systemic strangulation. The Spartan occupation of Declia was not a raid. It was a permanent siege engine installed at the city's doorstep. For the Athenian machine, This was the moment the internal friction became terminal. The design of the war had shifted from seasonal kinetic pulses to a constant state of attrition. From an analytical perspective, the fortification of Atelier was the most successful surgical strike of the Spartan land campaign. Advised by the turncoat Alcibiades, the Spartans abandoned the Archidamian cycle of annual invasions. By maintaining a year-round garrison, they achieved persistent interdiction, 20,000. Athenian slaves, the primary energy source of the silver mines and workshops, escaped to the Spartan lines. This was a massive resource extraction that crippled the Athenian economy. Athens was no longer a city-state supported by its hinterland. It was a garrison state entirely dependent on its naval umbilical cord. Every scrap of food, every piece of timber, and every drachma of capital now had to arrive via the sea. This shift forced the Athenian machine into a high-stress operating mode. The logistical pressure of feeding a city that could no longer farm its own soil meant that the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean, became the critical center of gravity. If the grain ships were stopped there, Athens would undergo total system failure within weeks. The canvas of conflict had expanded. The war was no longer about Attica, but about the control of flow across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The most significant tactical evolution of this phase was the entry of the Achaemenid Empire into the order of battle, the Persian shadow we discussed in segment I now became a kinetic reality. The Persian satraps, Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus, recognized a surgical opportunity to dismantle Greek power by funding Spartan naval ambitions. To the master historian, this is a classic study in geopolitical balancing. Persia did not want a Spartan victory. They wanted perpetual friction. By providing the gold to pay for Peloponnesian rowers, they ensured that the Greek civil war would continue until both sides reached maximum exhaustion. This Persian pivot introduced a new resource variable. Athenian naval superiority had always been built on technological proficiency and financial reserves. Now Sparta had infinite capital. They could lose a fleet and build another. Athens could not. This was economic enfilade, the Spartan admiral. A new breed of technocratic commander emerged to manage this surgical alliance. Foremost among them was Lysander, a man who understood that the art of war was now as much about diplomatic leveraging as it was about the Phalanx. The conflict moved to the Ionian Sea, where the order of battle became a series of high-precision naval engagements. The Athenian fleet, based at Samos, fought with the desperation of a cornered predator. The human forge of this era was one of operational fatigue. Athenian rowers, once the elite artisans of the sea, were now underpaid and malnourished. Yet, in a display of systemic resilience, the Athenians managed to win several tactical victories at Cynossema and Abydos, 411 BCE, and a grand kinetic collision at Cyzicus, 410 BCE, where they destroyed the entire Peloponnesian fleet and killed the Spartan admiral Mindarus. However, these victories were non-decisive. Because of the Persian variable, Sparta simply rebooted its naval program with more Achaemenid gold. Athens, meanwhile, was experiencing political system failures. The oligarchic coup of the 400 and the subsequent restoration of democracy created a command environment of extreme paranoia. The surgical logic of the military was constantly being overridden by the emotional volatility of the assembly. In 406 BCE, the friction of war reached a crescendo at the Battle of Arginusi. It was the largest naval engagement of the war, involving over 270 triremes. The Athenians, desperate to relieve a blockaded fleet at Mytilene, performed a total mobilization, even manning ships with slaves and resident aliens by promising them citizenship. This was extreme resource dilution. The Athenian victory at Arginusi was a tactical masterpiece. They utilized a modular formation that nullified the superior maneuvering of the now experienced Spartan crews. 70 Peloponnesian ships were sunk or captured, but the human forge exacted a terrible price. A sudden storma, natural frictional event, prevented the Athenian generals from rescuing thousands of shipwrecked sailors. In the surgical coldness of the aftermath, the Athenian assembly committed a self-inflicted decapitation, driven by demagogues. They tried and executed 6 of the 8 winning generals for their failure to rescue. From an analytical perspective, this was systemic suicide. At the very moment Sparta was appointing its most brilliant war architect, Lysander, Athens was purging its command logic. The machine had begun to consume its own control modules. In 405 BCE, Lysander returned to command, backed by the full financial weight of Cyrus the Younger, the Persian prince. Lysander's strategy was pure logistical interdiction. He moved his fleet to the Hellespont, occupying a position at Lampsacus that directly sat on the Athenian grain salient. The Athenian fleet of 180 ships followed him, taking up an inferior position at Aegospotami, an open beach with no logistical infrastructure. For 5 days, the friction of war was a psychological siege. Each day, the Athenians sailed out to offer battle. Each day, Lysander refused, waiting for the moment of maximum vulnerability. He was observing the Athenian entropy, the Athenian crews, forced to forage for food on shore, became tactically fragmented. On the 5th day, when the Athenian sailors had wandered far from their ships, Lysander launched a surgical kinetic strike. It was not a battle. It was an execution. In a single hour, 160 Athenian ships were captured on the beach without a fight. Only 9 ships escaped. The order of battle of the Athenian Empire was erased in a logistical blip, 3,000. Athenian prisoners were executed on the spot. A surgical removal of the city's last remaining naval capital. Aegospotami was the point of no return. Lysander did not attack Athens directly. He didn't need to. He simply closed the valve of the Hellespont. He sailed from city to city in the Aegean, systematically dismantling Athenian garrisons and sending all Athenian citizens back to Athens. This was deliberate overcrowding, a surgical application of famine. By increasing the city's population while cutting off its food supply, he forced the machine into total resource depletion inside the long walls. The human forge was one of silent starvation. The pride of the democratic thalassocracy was broken by the biological reality of hunger. There was no more naval shield, no more Persian shadow to play with, and no more resource depth. The design of conflict had reached its terminal state. The Decelean War reveals the final maturation of total war in the 5th century. We see that tactical brilliance, like Cyzicus or Arginusi, is irrelevant if the logistical foundation is compromised. Sparta won not through hoplite prowess, but through niveau adaptation and financial alignment. Lysander was the first modern general, a man who viewed war as a technical problem, to be solved through interdiction and political engineering. The Atelier of the war had produced its final, grim masterpiece, a total hegemony achieved through strategic strangulation. The Athenian operating system had been overwhelmed by a constant friction it was never designed to endure. The aperture now closes on the ruins of the long walls. As the Greek world prepares for an analytical assessment of the cost of 27 years of kinetic madness, the aperture opens on a singular rhythmic sound, the rhythmic strike of iron against stone. It is April 404 BCE. The viewer observes the long walls of Athens being dismantled. It is not a scene of chaotic destruction, but a choreographed deconstruction. Spartan flute players provide the tempo for the labor. To the Spartan mind, this music is a surgical tempo marking the end of a malignant hegemony. To the Athenians, each falling block is a synaptic severing of their imperial identity. This moment represents the ultimate systemic reset of the Hellenic world. The grand design of Pericles has not just failed. It has been surgically extracted from the geopolitical body of Greece. We now enter the post-operational assessment, the cold, clinical audit of a 27-year masterpiece of attrition. The first layer of our assessment is the demographic entropy. The Peloponnesian War was a biological meat grinder. While ancient records lack the surgical precision of modern data, the analytical trends are undeniable. Athens began the war with roughly 30,000 to 40,000 full citizens. By 404 BCE, that number had been halved. This was not merely a loss of kinetic units on the battlefield. It was the loss of quality capital. The plague of 430 BCE The catastrophe in Sicily and the final execution of the crews at Aegospotami removed the most experienced naval artisans and military architects of the age. The Spartan victory was achieved at the cost of their own genetic viability. To win a naval war, Sparta had to expand its operational reach, utilizing helots and Neodamedes, freed slaves, as soldiers. The human forge had also produced a new, dangerous social salient, the professional mercenary. Before 431 BCE, war was the seasonal craft of the citizen soldier. By 404 BCE, the economy of violence had shifted. Thousands of men across Greece now knew only the art of survival through the spear. This mercenary surplus would eventually fuel the anabasis of the 10,000 and the later campaigns of Alexander, effectively exporting Greek kinetic doctrines to the highest bidder, primarily the Persian Empire. From an analytical perspective, the war was an economic black hole. The financial architectonics of the 5th century were predicated on the flow of tribute and agricultural stability. Both were shattered. The surgical reality was that the Golden Age had been funded by imperial extraction, and that engine was now dead. The silver mines of Laurium were cold. The grain routes of the Hellespont were under Spartan, and thus Persian, oversight. The capital of Greece had been converted into kinetic waste, sunken triremes, shattered walls, and rusted bronze. This economic vacuum allowed Persia to transition from a passive observer to the primary financial stakeholder of Greek affairs. The king's peace of the 4th century would prove that Persian gold was more surgically effective than the Spartan phalanx ever was. Despite the ruin, the Atelier of conflict produced significant technological and tactical innovations. The Peloponnesian War was the laboratory where the combined arms doctrine was perfected. We saw the transition from the pure phalanx to a modular force structure, the rise of the peltast, the success of light-armed troops at Spectaria and during the Sicilian retreat proved that velocity and range could overcome mass and armor. This led to the Iphicratian reforms in the early 4th century, which optimized the kinetic balance of the infantrymen. The art of sieges. No longer were cities captured by mere starvation. Surgical engineering and artillery prototypes began to emerge as force multipliers, naval logistics. The war demonstrated that naval hegemony is a logistical function. The Spartan realization that capital plus Persian friendship equals naval parity fundamentally changed the maritime order. The most profound technical legacy was the professionalization of command. Men like Brasidas, Gylippus, and Lysander were not citizen generals in the old mold. They were war technicians who understood intelligence, logistics, and psychological operations. They viewed the battlefield as a canvas of strategic logic rather than a stage for Homeric valor. The analytical assessment of the post-war map reveals a fractured equilibrium. Sparta's attempt to impose dikarchies, 10-man oligarchies, on the former Athenian allies was a surgical failure. The Spartan operating system was too rigid for the dynamic maritime world of the Aegean. Their command logic was built on fear and garrisoning, which quickly generated frictional resistance from their own allies, Thebes and Corinth. The pivot point of Greek history had shifted. With Athens humbled and Sparta overextended, a strategic void opened in the north. The Peloponnesian War had distracted the great powers of the south, while the Kingdom of Macedonia was quietly refining its machine. The tactical innovations of the Peloponnesian War that combined arms, the professionalized command, the logistical depth would be studied and perfected by Philip II of Macedon. He would take the surgical lessons of the Greek Civil War and apply them to create a continental empire. Finally, we must assess the intellectual legacy of the conflict. Thucydides' history is not just a chronicle. It is a surgical manual for the analysis of power. He introduced the concept of realpolitik, the idea that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This calculus of force has become the standard operating procedure for global strategy for the next 2,500 years. The war proved that total conflict is an uncontrollable machine. Once the friction begins, The original design is almost always lost to the chaos of reality. Pericles' masterpiece of insulation was undone by a biological variable, the plague. Sparta's martial purity was corrupted by Persian capital. The assessment is clear. The Peloponnesian War was a zero-sum game, where the only true winner was the spectator in the east, Persia, and the patient observer in the north, Macedonia. As the long walls fell, the Greek experiment, in its purest form, fell with them. The war was the final incision that ended the age of the polis. What followed was an age of professional militarism, imperial consolidation, and eventually the Hellenistic expansion. The art of war had moved from the atelier of the citizen philosopher to the foundry of the professional conqueror. The Peloponnesian War remains a surgical case study in how strategic hubris, logistical overreach, and political instability can dismantle even the most sophisticated hegemonic machine. It is the story of two giants who, in trying to crush one another, broke the very ground upon which they both stood. War Atelier is the surgical lens through which we view the grand blueprint of history. We have deconstructed the Peloponnesian War from its architectonic design to its terminal entropy. This conflict serves as a timeless blueprinting of conflict, reminding us that the art of war is always a balance between strategic logic and human friction. If you demand this level of intellectual rigor and tactical depth in your historical analysis, ensure you are subscribed to War Atelier. We are the architects of narrative, and our canvas is the entire history of human conflict.